Go. Good morning and welcome to History Matters and So Does Coffee. Today, as promised on various social media platforms, we're going to talk about the National Archives. I was inspired in part by ridiculous things, not surprisingly, on social media, with people saying things like the National Archivist is a political flunky, or the National Archives doesn't mean anything, the president controls everything. Basically, people having a lot of bad things to say about the National Archives, which made me angry and also reveals to me people don't know what it is. They don't know what it does. They don't know what it is. They don't know why it's important. So that's what I want to talk about today, why it's important to democracy and to us. But before we get into that, I will turn to my partner in crime, Annie, who will explain the rules of the game.
Good morning, Joanne. I, for one, am very much looking forward to this topic. I'm a big fan of our National Archives. As a teacher, I've benefited from its programs and its contents over the years. So this is a show not to be missed. Good morning. I'm Annie Evans from New American History, and I'm delighted, as always, to be with you this morning. We are going to have a half-hour or so discussion about the National Archives with Joanne, and then I will come back on and we will look at some questions that you fine folks will be putting in the Q&A as Joanne is discussing the topic. So make sure that you put your questions in the Q&A. The chat is great and it's on fire this morning, but we will be looking for specific questions about this topic in the Q&A. See you all in a little bit.
Okay. Now, I will say first, that has nothing to do with what I'm about to talk about, just so that if people hear a noise, Birdhead over there, newbie, is about to break one of his toys into pieces because he's nibbling at it. So if you hear a bang and a lot of fluttering, just so you know. Okay, but what I really want to talk about today is the National Archives. And I'm going to do two things. I'm going to talk about what it is, why it does what it does, and why that's important. And then I realized in the process of thinking about what I was going to say this morning, I knew I'd done research at the National Archives. What I didn't remember until this morning is that I have some of my notes, including photocopies from an online version of what I was looking at. So what I want to do, so it might go a few minutes long, I want to recreate for you the process of looking at a government record at the National Archives, which revealed to me some things I didn't know before, but also like made very real a moment that gets about a paragraph in my book. So we're going to get a little bit of in-action National Archives research and I guess a little gratitude, National Archives gratitude in the course of what I want to talk about this morning. And I'll also say, if there's anyone here who is here for the first time, please say so in chat. Our wonderful History Matters community will give you a robust welcome. Okay, so National Archives, as I said, people are smacking away at the National Archives because it dares to say or do something that is getting in the way of their desires about feelings about need for the power of former President Trump, right? If the archives want something or need something and the former president didn't do it, then the archives must be bad. This isn't true. And as I suggested on every social media platform under the sun, the National Archives is vital for the working of democracy. Now, I want to read you, according to them, their mission, right? Because this, in a way, does a very good job of doing what I wanted to explain in more detail this morning. On their website, the National Archives says, our mission is to provide equitable public access to federal government records in our custody and control. Equitable access to government records strengthens democracy by allowing all Americans of all backgrounds to claim their rights of citizenship, hold their government accountable, and understand their history so they can participate more effectively in their government. Now, how is that for a nice, concise, handy statement of what it means to have an independent agency, which is what the National Archives is, an independent agency collecting, preserving, and ordering records from throughout American history for the sake, in part, of course, of people in office who actually have a need to know what came before them, but also for us, we the people. Those records of government officials essentially belong to us, and we have a right, not necessarily to look at all of the, and I have the number here, all of the 13 billion pages that are in the holdings of the National Archives, not counting things besides newspapers that are in the National Archives. So there are some things that are still considered classified, but a huge amount of what's in the National Archives is open to the public. And I encourage you to go to the National Archives website. First of all, they're wonderful at explaining who they are and what they do. People on social media who are pretending that they don't know, go there. And also they have a big online catalog. I copied that figure down too. The online catalog makes available over 160 million records. Plus they have a huge number of things that have been digitized and are already online. So for any number of reasons, there's actually a lot that's available. You don't even have to go to the archives to necessarily get to it. And its holdings are vast to the point that, as I'll talk about in a few minutes, certainly for me, when I go to the National Archives and there are different record groupings, they could be huge. And it's not as though every piece of paper, it's not when you delve into a category of record, you don't know every piece of paper that's going to be in there. It's a vast amount of paper. So there's all kinds of amazing stuff lurking, and sometimes filed away under like records of a committee, which is part of what I'm going to show you in a little bit. There's an amazing amount of information there, and it's not all known because there's so much of it. So it's significant in the working and running of our political system, a new administration. Any new office holders need to know that if they need to, that they can get access to records that might affect what they're doing, in addition to whatever records their branch might have, the congressional record and other such things. But equally important, and I probably said accountability at this point, maybe 100 million times, I don't know, a lot of times. And it sounds like a sort of vague, ethereal idea. Yes, we can hold the government accountable, but I mean that in a very specific and very serious way. You can go and find in the records what you want to find. And if people who are power holders know that their records are available in that way, ideally, they won't necessarily be as sneaky or corrupt as they might otherwise be, but we have a right as citizens to know that information. And that right matters. It's not necessarily a guarantee of accountability by any means, but it's a tool of accountability. And for that reason, it's really vitally important. As a matter of fact, I wasn't going to talk about this, but I'll mention it because it's a great example of the National Archives actually doing something that they shouldn't have done and admitting it. And why doing this thing altered the public record. And some of you might remember this, but in January of 2020, a Washington Post reporter noticed that in a photo, an image of the 2017 Women's March, there was a public exhibit up at the archives about it, and noticed that some of the signs in these photographs were blurred. What they said was blurred out. So people ask the archives, why are you blurring out part of an image, right? You're the National Archives. You're supposed to be preserving things, not hiding things. And some complained that not only was this censoring language, but it altered the meaning of some protest signs. And apparently some of them had potentially offensive language. Some of them specifically mentioned at the time President Donald Trump. The agency said two things which don't necessarily line up with each other, but I'll repeat them. So the agency first said, that the National Archives, they made these changes so as not to engage in current political controversy, which I will not open my mouth about, but don't know about that excuse. But then they said, and we made a mistake and we were wrong to alter the image. That's more credible to me. So there's an example of a record of some kind being kept, the archives altering it in some way, even just for display, but given that they are the archive of record, literally, it meant something. And people called them on it, and they admitted it and addressed it. So what it holds, how it holds them matters. And the archives as a whole, it has the records of government agencies, it has federal court cases, it has presidential administrations, and any number of other things. Also on its website, it says that it is a national civic educator because of what it makes available and because it has all kinds of educational programs and user guides and a variety of other things. For those reasons too, it matters. In addition, the National Archives controls or supervises, better word, the records in presidential libraries, in some regional archives, in some federal records centers. Apparently there are 44 facilities in 18 states that the National Archives, in one way or another, organizes, controls, supervises their records. I think there are somewhere or other, I read this morning that there are 3,000 all told national archival employees, full and part-time, around the nation doing this job of this complicated, difficult, and time-consuming job of collecting, preserving, ordering, and keeping the record of the nation, of the government. Now, actually, I'm not normally a person who uses crunchy numbers, but I found this interesting too. Of all of the documents and materials that are created in the course of the regular business, political business of the United States federal government, between 1% and 3%, only between 1% and 3% are considered important for legal or historical reasons that they need to be kept by the National Archives forever. Think about that. We're talking about 1% to 3%, which kind of is believable given the amount of paper, red tape, and everything else floating around. I mean, as someone who worked for the Library of Congress for a number of years, I can testify to that. But 1% to 3% is what we're talking about here, that they are preserving and holding on to of what the federal government produces. Okay, I want to see what else I want to mention here. So a little bit about the history of the National Archives and how it came to be. So originally, different branches of the government maintained their own records. And you may remember, I've told the story more than once, and I will not tell it again in full now, but I have talked before about in the early Congress, I think this is when Jefferson is president, a member of Congress from New Hampshire named William Plumer goes into the lumber room of the building serving as the Capitol at that point and sees records, congressional records, strewn all over the place, no care really being taken at all. And he's horrified, and he decides to make it his mission to collect and order these congressional records. So there's Congress taking care of its records in the early years. So there was clearly not huge supervision going on in the preservation of records, and presidents in those early years often left some papers behind, took some papers with them. I mean, in the founders online database, which is open and publicly accessible, has all of the available writings of Jefferson, Adams, Washington, Hamilton, Madison. That's run by the National Archives, and that is a compilation of some of what these people took with them and other things that remained in the hands of the government. Over the years, the State Department kind of became an unofficial sort of National Archives for important federal documents. And for a while, that's where the Declaration of Independence was. That's where the Constitution was. Some of these things were turned over to the Library of Congress in 1921. But this I found interesting. The push to have an actual national archive of records in part comes about because of the rise of the professionalization of archivists and historians. The American Historical Association is created in 1884, and it begins to talk about the need for a national archive, for the preservation of records, for the preservation of American history, political history, and other kinds of history. So The editor of the American Historical Review, J. Franklin Jameson, is the guy who comes forward and says we need a national archives. And he submits a plan and suggests that it's important. And there's ultimately a plan for a hall of records that's sent to Congress, and Congress had very little interest in that. But people who are interested in the preservation of information, again, for political reasons, for civic reasons, for the process of doing political business reasons, they kept pushing. So first, there's the publication of a guide to the archives of the government of the United States, not to the building archives, but to the archives that generally are being held. Then there's a fire in the Commerce Department, and it destroyed the census records of 1890. And suddenly people thought, oh, maybe we should have a building or a place or something where we're actually preserving these records with care. Because look, things can be very readily destroyed. So in 1926, Congress actually gives some funding towards the creation, at least of a building. And those funds are increased. By 1941, it's reported that the building cost at the time a little over $12 million, which apparently is the equivalent to $177 million in roughly today's money, and is put halfway between the Capitol and the White House. Symbolic. Washington building location, some of it is quite symbolic, and that's a very appropriate place for the National Archives to be. Now, as so many things are true in American history, Watergate pushes things further because of Nixon wanting to take records with him, questions about tapes and other things. Obviously, the National Archives gets wrapped up in a really, talk about political controversy, a major current political controversy. And as a result of that, in 1978, Congress passes the Presidential Records Act. That's where that comes from. And it designates all of the records of US presidents as the property of the US government, and says that they must be deposited with the National Archives at the end of a president's term. Now, I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail. Some of it, the National Archives has handily now offering frequently asked questions about presidential records, which many people are interested in now, that talks about, for example, a president can decide that a document is personal and designate it that way, but I believe he has to do that while he's in office, and the National Archives has to give written approval of documents that are being deemed personal and take it away. I find this distinction between personal and political documents fascinating because for years I've said, and I think I talk about it briefly in my first book, there's a collection of papers, for example, it's like the public papers of Aaron Burr. I can't even remember the precise title, but it suggests it's his political papers. But the fact of the matter is, it's the private papers sometimes that have the most political information. So already this distinction of personal and political is a little fuzzy, and you can see how that's going to be prone to cause controversy. That's one issue. Another issue is taking records with you and then not giving them back when you're asked to give them back. That's a big problem. But I won't go into that. I want to read a quote which wonderfully captures what I'm talking about here as far as the larger significance of the National Archives and why it's so important to our idea about ourselves as a nation and to the functioning of democracy, and testifies to the importance of history too. And then I want to show you a little bit about researching at the National Archives and what happens there. So Franklin Delano Roosevelt, is the person who first really initially created the first presidential library, took a great interest in this idea of a National Archives. And he offered these words at the dedication of his own library in 1941, but they're pretty well captured in some of what I'm talking about this morning. So these are Roosevelt's words: to bring together the records of the past and to house them in buildings where they will be preserved for the use of men and women in the future. A nation must believe in three things. It must believe in the past, It must believe in the future. It must, above all, believe in the capacity of its own people so to learn from the past that they can gain in judgment in creating their own future. Thank you, FDR. All of these things. And I, here in History Matters land, I do not like using big, broad, rhetorical, fuzzy, sweeping language, because I want us to be grounded in what's really happening and the real information that's coming at us and the real ways in which we have to sort through our current political climate. But when I say that the National Archives is vital to the functioning of democracy, sounds lofty and ethereal, but I mean that in a very concrete kind of way. For all of the reasons that I've named and more, it's essential. And it's an independent agency because of its vital importance. Now, I want to offer you a little peek into probably the most extended time I spent at the National Archives, and it was in conjunction with the Field of Blood. And what I discovered was congressional committees, and I don't know if this is true for all of them, but many of them, congressional committees, their papers, what's produced up from that committee, there's a part of the stacks, which I was taken into by a kind person who worked at the National Archives. And I was, as a historian, I was like, oh, box after box after box after box of the papers from a variety of different congressional committees. Now, what I was interested in was a committee, an investigative committee that was created in, I believe, 1840. I'm going to give you a very brief account of it, because one member of Congress almost tried to shoot someone testifying before a committee, and they investigated that because poor fellow who thought he was going to have a gun aimed at him and he was going to be killed went and complained and said, I was testifying and they pulled a gun on me. So this happens in 1840. And this has to do with Andrew Jackson, President Jackson, and his pet banks. Henry Wise, who is my most frequent fighter in my book, from Virginia, consistently using violence or threats of violence to get his way, and then bragging accurately that he's elected to do precisely that, and he wins re-election again and again and again, proving that to be the case. So there's a committee talking about pet banks. Henry Wise is there, and his friend Bailey Peyton, who's from Tennessee, is also there. And there's a man named Reuben Whitney who is testifying. He's an agent for some of these pet banks. Now, apparently, at some point in recent weeks, Whitney had called Peyton a liar in the press. Never a good idea. So that when Peyton, during his testimony, made sort of an offhand, semi-sneering comment about Peyton jumped to his feet and threatened to kill Whitney. Wise, who had been apparently telling funny stories across the room, saw what was happening, rushed over and put his hand in his pocket in case he needed to pull his gun. And there they were, right? With one guy saying, I'm going to kill you. Here, I have my gun. Another guy, I'm ready to defend my buddy Bailey Peyton. Got my gun. Wise later said if Whitney had moved his arm 1 inch as if to reach for a gun, he, quote, would have killed him on the spot. Thank you, Henry Wise. Ultimately, though, Wise does the right thing, and he calms everyone down, and Reuben Whitney exits stage left, and that's over. Now, what I wanted to know was some more detail about what happened there. I wanted the record of that committee. Obviously, someone pulling a gun or threatening to kill someone in a committee room, if you're talking about congressional violence, that has significance. So I went to the National Archives, went to the magical place with all the drawers. I'm going to try not to drop all of this. So first, some of it, I just sat and took pencil notes, very exciting. Because that was all I could do, right? This was a good number of years ago. I couldn't take pictures of it. It wasn't on microfilm. I made a note here that, actually it might be 18. I haven't gotten the year wrong for you. Anyway, I'll go back and check the year. But at any rate, I noticed that they spelled Whitney wrong in the notes. Reuben Withers. So whoever the record keeper is needs to like wake up a little bit. But it's all kinds of notes about the committee and who they wanted to interview, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so I took some notes, and then I see back here. You don't need those notes. Then they have on microfilm some of the other notes that are in the box. And I just want to show you sort of what they look like. So this is a page from this big record book that had committee holding. And it goes on and on. It's different sizes, different kinds of notes. You know, things added in the margins, things crossed out, things underlined. Actually, this is done by a clerk, clearly. And so the handwriting is really, really clear, which never, rarely happens. So that this is quite legible. And you'll see why that matters, because at the end is here. So I'm reading through and I'm seeing what happens, and I'm getting the evidence about who pulled a gun on who and what happened and who was testifying and who wasn't. And then at the end of this big record book about what happened in the committee, I'm going to show it to you and then I'm going to try to read it. There's this bit here that's in a very different handwriting from everything that comes before. And here's what it says. And so Reuben M. Whitney was discharged together with all others concerned, on trial or not on trial. The end of the whole matter being that after the parties got off about as well. Oh, the whole matter being that all the parties, not great handwriting, got off about as well as the man who received 40, saved 1, swam the river, and come off clear. Now, I did a little digging this morning to try and see what the saying is, because come off clear, he underlines. It's clearly like a folk saying or something, which I don't have a clue as to what it is. And so I wanted to show that to you. First of all, I love the fact that somebody, and I don't know if it was a clerk, I don't know if it was someone in the room, I don't know if it was a member of Congress who went and like added this little, and thus ended the story of Reuben Whitney. Nothing happened at all, and they all came out clear. I didn't need to investigate who said that, why they said it, but I love that it's there because it's just somebody sort of making half fun of the entire thing. And I also wanted to show it to you because I still don't really know what that joke is about. So if I wanted to know, I started this morning, I was like, come off clear, swam the river, saved 40. Does it say 40? I think it says 40. Anyway, doing all of those things in the small amount of time I had this morning did not. That's right. Some of you, I'm sure, you can delve in and figure this out. I could not. But anyway, I wanted to show that to you because I knew the committee, the work that it did. I knew why it was there. I didn't have all of these details. And ultimately, there's a committee record, but I didn't have all of these details about what went on. And even at one point, because Bailey Payton was so upset at Reuben Whitney agreed that he would not answer questions by speaking, but would write them down on pieces of paper so that he wouldn't rile Bailey Payton, who was very upset. The box had the little pieces of paper that Reuben Whitney used to answer the questions when he was no longer allowed to speak. So there is a record of a committee and what it did, but a record even of the working of the committee. Now, this is something, now I have to look to make sure I'm getting it right for you. I said 1840, so I closed the book. It's either 1837 or 1840, and you can find it. But regardless of the specific year that it happens, there would be no way really to get at the working of the committee in that way without that kind of record. This is the mid-19th century, even the early 19th century. But that's true for any number of other things that are in the National Archives. That's why it's so important that they get these records, keep these records, mind these records, know where they are, and preserve them. So it's not, I think some of the discussion today has devolved into a kind of, who gets the records? Well, Trump wants the records. It's a matter of his vanity, whatever. He likes to keep boxes of documents. I don't know all of the things that I'm seeing in a variety of different places. And that's fine. People can say whatever they want to say about this, but the fact of the matter is things that are not at the National Archives, presidential records, not at the archives knows they're not there and says we need them back, and then they're ignored. That's significant. That's a part of the record that the archives knows exists and wants for the complete record that it doesn't have. Now, we'll have questions in a moment after this. And it is true that any number of presidents end up taking some documents with them when they leave. But then the National Archives says we need them back. You took them with you and people give them back, right? So the fact that the archives knows that these things are missing in and of itself is significant. But that's why what we're looking at now and what's continuing to unfold, that's part of why it matters. The National Archives, an independent agency, is responsible for the record of the working of our government. And that's important to people in government. That's important to us. And that you can't really grasp even at accountability without knowing that there's as close as you can get to a full and accurate record of what's going on. I see a little applause going up there. So I don't know if you're an archivist or a librarian, but you get major applause today if you are. So that's what I want us to focus on as whatever happens and is going to continue to unfold. And people will be focusing on all kinds of weird aspects of the indictment of a former president, which is a big deal, historically speaking. But don't forget that what we're talking about here is not just the former president, but the stashing away of something that's ours, and it happens to be classified information that has risks involved in having it not be kept safely where it belongs. Don't take your eyes off the actual record that was took and what it means for it to be not just taken, but kept despite the archives asking for it back. What does that mean? What does that reveal? And think about the fact that other information of that kind is at the archives, and a certain amount of information at the archives is considered classified and is not publicly available. So anyway, that I just wanted to say, let's not get caught up in only the drama that's unfolding around the person of former President Trump, and not forget how important it is that these documents are in our national record, available to us and to others. That's how democracy works. You have access to what has happened. It's the only way, as Roosevelt suggested, you have any hope of trying to do better in the future, seeing what happened in the past, understanding it often on a granular level, the process, the paper process, and then being able to do better. Okay. Mug. I see the mug. Okay. So if there's anyone here this week who is new, every week for, I can't remember what episode this is, 160 something. I don't know. We've been here for, we do need a 168 system. We've been doing this for a really long time. Maybe 168 straight episodes, 168. Thank you. And every week I've come up with a mug that has something to do with the topic being talked about. Sometimes it's a bigger stretch than others. I would say this one is a little bit of a stretch, but just come along with me, humor me. And I think this might be a Caroline mug, but I don't know. Not only does it say history should make you uncomfortable, ask questions, challenge assumptions, think. It's the ask questions part. It's the fact that what this is saying is the process of history matters. And what I'm talking about today is the fodder for the process of history. It makes perfect sense to me that the rise of the American Historical Association was part of what pushed this effort to create a national archives. Historians, man, historians want to keep the receipts. So, okay, some people, I've tried as hard as I could, guys. this, even with all the wonderful mugs you gave me at the NCHG conference, sometimes still, I'm like, I haven't used this one before. That's cool. And I will say, I think it's Carolee that it is. Okay. Because so she also put on there the tweet where I basically said that to begin with. So the full specialness of this mug needs to be revealed. Okay. I will now stop talking since I went long. Okay.
That was a great mug reveal. Well, the chat has been super active.
I've been able to see, and it's very hard for me to block it out. I've seen all kinds of stuff happening under there.
But we also have tons of questions we want to get to. So I want to jump right in if you're ready. The first one comes from Ellen. Ellen says, regarding your tweet about Social Security cuts in the new budget, it galls me when they force people to pay Social Security and call it entitlement, like we're getting it for free. What are some other similar examples gaslighting Congress tried to foist on we the people?
Oh.
I'm not sure how that relates to archives. I probably should have saved that one for that party.
It threw me a little bit. It doesn't relate to archives. I would say I can't put my finger on one. What I thought this morning when I saw this report that was released by 175 Republican members of the House, I believe is the number, with what they want the budget to be. They finally sort of came up with something, is that they released it now. They released it, I don't know if it was yesterday or today, in the middle of the fuss over the former president and his records. You have to think about the words that people use. You have to think about, as we've said here many times, you have to think about the feelings you have when you read other people's words. The timing matters too. So part of me felt that, and again, this is based on nothing but gut instinct. It was released now because the hope is that it won't be able to compete with other things that are happening right now on the record. It should, because during President Biden's State of the Union address, when he said something about cutting Social Security and the Republicans were like, no, we'll never do it. Well, they now want to change the age when you can retire and get Social Security, among other things. So I can't give you a specific example of other congressional gaslighting. There's lots of it. In the case of this one, I will just highlight the fact of the timing of it, because it's a little bit of a, distraction. Yes, it's deflecting. It's a distraction move. Like, you go look over there. Sorry, Social Security is getting affected, and Medicare too.
Scare the seniors, get their mind off what's really happening. We're not that silly. We are still paying attention. We can have two things in our brain at once. Okay. This one I'm thinking comes from Jessica because it says National Council for History Ed, unless John is now asking questions in the Q&A. So it's got to be one of those two people, Nancy Drew. Okay, so NCHE asks, what is the impact of our documents being in digital format and not paper format? How are the archives and others managing government primary sources in tweets or mail for posterity?
That's a really interesting question. And obviously, over the years, as different things develop and different practices begin, archives have to adapt and figure out what to do. And that's not always obvious. So I remember 100 million years ago, I was probably in grad school. Oh, no, this was before grad school. Okay, so it's really 100 million years ago. It's when I was employed by the Library of Congress. It's before I went to grad school. And I was at a meeting in the manuscript division, and the conversation was, when it came to government records, what are we collecting? Because there aren't, like, while you were out, notes that they're collecting about phone calls. There weren't even necessarily records of phone calls. At that point, there were not yet tweets, but they were worried about what form evidence was going to come in and how they were going to keep it. Now, in that case, they're like worried about, there's different kinds of printed records. There must have been a fascinating meeting about what to do about, a tweeting president must have brought it right into the forefront. It would be interesting, fascinating to see what they had to say about that. In when you go to the National Archives website, which I encourage you to do, somewhere in there, it says something about collecting everything. And it says blah, 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 and tweets. So they
it does.
clearly considered it. But it's a huge question. It's a huge question, right? It affects, same thing when I was at a meeting of the Motion Picture and Recorded Sound Division of the Library of Congress. What format are they keeping films and audio on? Because whatever that format is, hopefully there are going to be machines that are going to enable you to watch or listen to those things. Big question. It's just, and it's really fascinating. There we go. Look at Tim. From the National Archives, Records Management of Social Media and Electronic Resources. You see, the history matters, people. There you are. Anyway, it's a really good question because it has to do with what gets included in the record of our history, right? And tweets are a public statement of sorts, so they should be part of the record.
Yeah, and so Jacqueline or Jen, I can't remember. Somebody's put something in there about, it was Jen. Is it acceptable for a president to delete a tweet? What is that part of the presidential record? That's why I think the lawsuit that the Internet Archive has going on right now is really important, because even if a president or any public official deletes a tweet, you can still use the Wayback Machine. That tweet is never really gone because of, you know, sites like the Internet Archive. So I hope that that lawsuit, as it moves forward, I hope that that is resolved in a favorable way. That was a great question.
Yeah, well, and that's the other thing, right? Is that sometimes, I think I saved something online this morning, someone saying, doesn't this make it more important for archives to hold on to the actual material artifact rather than trusting everything to be digitized? Yeah. Like, yeah. And I remember, again, even at the Library of Congress, sometimes just because of the need for room, they were getting rid of some old records of sorts. And I remember, like, you know, you can't get rid of old records. Like, I know you've digitized them, but that doesn't feel right. And as I suggested throughout this entire episode, it matters. What goes away is gone. And even with the Wayback Machine, if it's not readily accessible or people don't know it's there,
Yeah,
there could be something pretty important that poof has been disappeared.
So Jen has a backup question. She says, there are reason archivists are not part of the packing up papers for high-ranking government officials. You know, is it just a manpower issue, or is there another reason? I think what she's getting at is, why wasn't there someone there before the last president left office, making sure that he didn't pack up things that shouldn't have left the building?
Oh, it's a good question. I don't know normally how that works. So I don't know if under normal circumstances. I do know that obviously, well, actually what I do know, among other things, is that I did read this today. The archives doesn't wait till the end and then, like, let's take it all. That apparently as they go along in a presidential administration, they're collecting. And somewhere online, it acknowledged that that was hard to do when Donald Trump was president, because he tended to rip up or dispose. Do you remember all that, of records? But I don't know in that last end of a presidency, when it is, you know, a president is supposed to be organizing and handing over whatever hasn't already been handed over. I don't know if there's an archives official who checks in, or if people in the executive office check in with the archivist. I don't know how that works, but you are right. It would be smart. But the fact of the matter is, if you want to keep certain things as a president and take them with you, you probably can do it. The question then is, what happens when someone not necessarily catches you at it, but notes that things are missing? Then what do? You return them because it's part of the national record and it belongs to the American people, or you hide them and pretend that you don't have them. I will end my commentary there, but that's not the correct thing to do, particularly with classified national security documents. Okay.
Yeah. Sydney asks, does the government withhold information to skew public opinion in order to seem more appealing or to stay in power? How effective are they at doing so?
Repeat that for me.
She's asking if the government withholds information to skew public opinion, either in their own favor or to stay in power, and how effective are they at doing that?
Well, so that's always a possibility. this is part of why a responsible, active, free press is important. Because what a responsible, active, free press should be doing is investigating, recording, asking questions, and following through on things so that they can say, for example, I don't know who it was who noted the blurred signs of the Women's March in the National Archives exhibit, but when someone noticed and said, hey, then it became an issue. So yeah, I mean, having worked for the government, the amount of paper and the number of people and the processes and systems, and it's mind-blowingly complicated, and there's so much paper. If you're in the know and you have power, you can change the record, right? But that's part of what we're talking about this morning. The National Archives at least has a sense of what it should be getting, and all throughout a presidency is taking it. So is it possible to trick the American people? Yes. Is there a chance that that trick might be found by an active free press or the National Archives? Yes. Or a whistleblower of sorts, who knows? So it's not a fail-proof system, right? It still is, underneath it all, it's human, and it relies on somewhere. Again, this morning I saw someone talked about libraries and archives being based on trust, on faith, on the fact that you give what you're supposed to give to it and you get what you're supposed to get from it, which I think is true. So, you know, again, that's part of why the record of the archive belongs to us and is, generally speaking, open, because then you can investigate and you can find out, or others can do that for you who are in the know, as to what you might not know and what perhaps you should know. How else would we know, right? How else would we have a clue as to what might be swept underneath the rug or anything? So yes, things can be swept under the rug readily. Ideally, systems, record keeping, archivists, actual honest government officials are keeping the most of the record in place. And the press, it remains ideally a tool of accountability for the government, making the government accountable.
I really miss the museum, brick and mortar museum that used to be in DC for that reason. They did such a great job explaining a lot of that.
Yeah.
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 Okay.
I know.
It was one of my favorites. I was sad when it closed. Okay, so Tom Pinellas, back in 1982, he says he wrote a short squib for Chicago Magazine about the Federal Archives and Records Center. He said it's a rich load of historical census data for their local area, among other things. He's wondering how many other local satellite archive offices like that there are around the country. I know that outside of DC and Virginia, around the Fauquier County, Warrenton area, there's a satellite archives office for some of the oversized items like the giant larger maps and things, because I've driven by there, but you have to have, I think they said a congressman or somebody has to write a letter to get you in there. That one's kind of hard to get into.
There's all kinds of archives, I know, around the country, and I can't give you an overbranching sort of sense of that, but there are, and different kinds of archives have different demands of you. Sometimes you have to prove yourself a researcher or something, or a member of Congress, right, or whatever. But see, this is part of what, to me, part of the fun of being a historian, is trying to figure out not only what the stuff is, but where the stuff is. And even best of all, can I find stuff nobody has found before by being really creative in the questions I ask and the places I go? That's, then you're like off in your own investigative world, potentially coming up with something significant to say about history, because you're pursuing what is not even a network, just scattered archives and holdings all over the country. There's something here I wanted to respond to. I did want to respond to that. Linda said, Heather noted that they're trying to dismantle the entire government. In relation to that, I do want to say, and this is certainly related to the question of the archives, we are already seeing some people who would like to erase aspects of our national history and prevent them from being taught, or pass sweeping legislation about what is not allowed in schools, so sweeping and so vague that anything can be lumped under it, and it encourages people to hold back and not pick certain books or not speak about certain things because they can't tell whether they're legal or not. So we are watching people actively trying to erase part of our past. And it's not just a matter of mind control, right? That's almost like I don't need to say it, but I'm going to say it anyway. If you can erase part of the past and pretend that it doesn't exist, you are going to shape the present and the future. It's a power maneuver. It's dangerous to pretend like things didn't happen, to cast blame on other people for things that did happen. Changing history with a deliberate agenda in mind it's a public act, and it's an anti-democratic act. And I'm not talking about, one time I doctors, I have interesting conversations with a doctor, different occasion. I said I was a historian, and he said, I hope you're not one of those revisionists. I said, well, all historians potentially are revisionists, right? We're asking different questions, we're getting evidence, maybe different evidence, and we're coming up with new ideas. That's how history works and proceeds. We build on what's happened before. So yeah, attacking, the independence of the National Archives, for example, it's an independent agency under the executive branch. Sure, you could take away the independence of the National Archives. I think they only gained full independence in 1984 as an agency. You could take that away and then control what gets left of what a president is doing. And they could have, according to the archives, a stellar, beautiful, wonderful record of only doing wonderful things. And that would be all that would be left. So yeah, erasing records isn't just an archival matter. It's a political matter. It's a democratic matter.
Yeah. All right, our friend, I think we have time for one or two more. Scott was wondering, does the National Archives hold top secret documents?
I mean, it seemed as though all I can say is a certain percentage of what they have there are classified and not to be seen. I don't know what that means. So I don't know how top secret the secret documents are. Potentially they do hold that sort of thing. And again, maybe potentially for the past, but not the present. I don't know the answer to that question. But they certainly have some things that are not readily available to people that are in some way or another classified.
Okay, I'm going to combine a Miranda question and a Rabbi Beth question. Miranda's wondering, do we know how much has been stolen from the National Archives over the years? And Beth wondered, do they keep records of who accesses what, like a log of some sort? Those seem to go together.
Yeah, well, so there have been thefts. There have been thefts. I don't know if it's a full record, but I did see, again, somewhere this morning, a list of things that were stolen and found from the National Archives. It's a good question. When you use an archive, you have your ID, you have some kind of a card with a number on it, right? You are a recorded presence in some way in many archives, and then you put in writing what it is you want, and then that call slip in part gets you the box, but the call slip usually has multiple layers, right? The kind that goes with the box, the one that you get as the holder. So is there a record? Do archives keep records of who's asking for what? I don't know the answer to that, but they could. And they could, and perhaps, well, I don't know. I'm not even going to go with more perhapses. I was going to say perhaps for a certain length of time and not, all time. But the fact of the matter is there is a record of what you have asked for when you ask for something in an archive, because you ask on paper. You put in a call slip.
Yeah.
Oh, wait, so Sydney, are records kept in boxes? I just want to answer that basic question. It depends on the record, but generally speaking, there are acid-free boxes that are like, like this wide, and they have a top that sort of, opens, sort of hinge opens, and there are folders in it, often chronological, sometimes alphabetical. And a lot of records, that's when you go to an archive, that's what you get, is one of those acid-free boxes with folders in it. And so, but again, that's not going to be true of all records. And actually there are oversized records. So if you went to the Library of Congress, if you went to their, I bet now, if you went to their website and you looked in their finding aids, or any library's finding aids for specific collections, it'll say, you know, John Smith papers, 10 boxes, 1 folder for oversized materials. So, which I'm always like, okay, oversized or random materials. I want to see like what's digging around in there, like what doesn't fit in the boxes. But so mostly boxes, but not only.
Yeah, I know a lot of museums and state archives will do teacher workshops in the summer, and a big part of that is taking them into the basement or the 3rd floor where they keep those boxes and letting teachers, you know, they put gloves on. Someone asked, how do you know which ones need gloves and which don't? That was in the chat, not the Q&A, but I always wonder why some things, is it the age of the document or anyway, but they would let the teachers each pick a box and you didn't know what was in it. And it was kind of like an aha, and each person would have a box. And you
I do that for my students.
Oh, I loved it so much.
Undergrad seminars. One is the age of Jefferson and Hamilton. One is the creation of the American politician. In one class, they go to the library, they learn a little bit about databases, and then they're each given a box, an archival box. And in one way or another, it's political, and they are given a chunk of time to dig through the box and see what they find. And then we go around and talk about what they found. And then they get to see, first of all, just like the question that was Sydney just asked, right? That there's like folders, and how do you know what's there? And you can't read the handwriting because from my time period, it's all handwritten. It's great. And, you know, I always say to them, you're at Yale University, where you might be holding a letter from James Madison or Thomas Jefferson, and you could sit in the library in a class and hold that kind of material. Like, that's part of why I do it, because if I can give that to the students, I'm going to give it to the students. But it is true. And I will say, Sydney seems to be in on the fun aspect of this. My favorite thing is to do research. My favorite thing, right? And now I'm in like an eternal writing phase. But my favorite thing is to do research. You never know what you're going to find, particularly when you're doing on-site research. And sadly, there's a lot now that's in databases, which is great on the one hand, but on the other hand, it means you so much more rarely get the actual stuff in your hand, and that matters. And that matters if you go to a database and search on something, you find the thing you asked for and nothing else. Mm-hmm. If you go to an archive and you're looking for something, but you see so many other things that shape your thinking. So Peter Onuf, a long time ago, my former graduate advisor, talked about what he called database books, which are going to be books where people look for something and get it and then write about it, devoid of all of the context and things you find when you really delve in and do research. And that's a risk, right? Of having the wonder of databases, is not thinking to step back and get the larger context, the page that an important article is on. Is it off in the corner, or is it big on the page? What does that suggest? Yeah. When am I going to be teaching again after I go back to teaching in the fall?
Kathleen is asking, are there any other presidents who came anywhere close to being entangled in this many legal battles and were still elected afterwards? Who took information, refused to return to archives, or other legal battles?
I'm trying to think. I don't know. I mean, I'm not readily thinking of one. Pardon?
I was thinking Nixon with the tapes at first, but
right. That's the obvious example, but
I don't know.
Yeah, no, I don't know for sure. I don't want to defame someone by claiming.
Right. Interesting. Perhaps more of that will come out as this other tragedy unfolds.
Well,
Mark,
for sure. That would be good.
Yeah. Mark was wondering, how are classified documents at the National Archives declassified and released to the public? Is there some sort of mandatory wait time, or how might that work?
I think it depends. I think in some cases there's a wait period. again, which I read about this morning, and I can't give you the specifics about it, but it depends. And this isn't necessarily true in the National Archives, but an example that I found somewhat interesting. I think I've talked about it once before in the last 3 years. I was doing research at the British Library, and I was researching dueling and Parliament. And there was a collection of a member of Parliament who in one way or another was involved in a duel. And when the records were given in the 19th century to the British Library, the prerequisite for someone being able to see them was that it had to be a person of good character. Only people of good character could see this collection. And the person working at the library said, well, only people of good character can see this collection. Are you a person of good character? And I said, well, I'll tell you yes, but they're like, that ding was like my brother who said, are you okay? I saw on social media that you went to a doctor. Anyway, I just totally lost track of what I was saying. Help me find my path back here. What was I just talking about? Somebody put it in. The
original question was asking about the declassification of the documents. It was Julia.
Oh, a person of good character, right? So the librarian wanted me to go and find someone to write on behalf of my character, so that I could see this letter. And I
Like
kept
a
pushing.
recommendation just to
I was like,
the paper.
So I'm in London. You want me to like contact what, the history department at Yale University to get them to fax over it? Like what? I said, oh, you know what? I came here with a friend and we're sharing a hotel room. Maybe I'll just go and ask her and she can write something on a piece of paper and I can bring it back to you. Will that do? And pretty soon I backed this guy into a corner and he was just like, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
The damn letter from 1835. But sometimes, again, I don't know if that's necessarily true of the National Archives, but sometimes there are very specific prerequisites, some of them ancient, for getting access to records.
Yeah. All right, we have 2 questions left. I know we're running a little over, but I'm going to squeeze at least one of these in. Tim asked, why do you think it took till 1934 for the U.S. to establish a National Archives? Was there some sort of tension with the Library of Congress? You know, because earlier documents were first funneled there. Why the separation in 2 separate?
Oh yeah, so first they first the building to house it, and then it took a while to come up with the separate agency. I think, you know, historians were pushing for, you know, something that I think the ease with which it was decided that there should, well, relative ease to have a building had to do with the fact that there was a fire that wiped out all of these records. And suddenly it was like, oh, we should be, you know, doing something to preserve records. That was in a way an easier thing to pass than to create a new government agency of sorts. That's the only explanation I can find, but you're right that I didn't calculate the difference between when they decided to create the building and then when they decided to actually like create the agency within it, but there was a span of time between that.
Yeah. All right, the last question, I think we can do it. Dale says, I know about the rules regarding entering the National Archives, things like pens, pencils, food, but he wanted to know, are there rules about minimum age or other restrictions to limit the use of the archives? Like, you have to be 18, 21?
There could be. I don't know specifically for the National Archives, but many archives do have, you know, affiliated with a research agency, a certain age, all kinds of things like that. And it really does depend on the archive. And it's really good for you to look that up ahead of time so that you're prepared when you go, because sometimes they're quirky, maybe even antiquated, depending on the archive. And it might not be something very difficult for you to get a record of, but if you're not prepared, surprise, you can't take anything for granted when you're looking for records of things, I guess is maybe what I'll say, which is part of why it's so fun, right? Is you really don't know what you're going to find. And the things that I've found in archives over the years, I mean, not even just paper, but other things folded in, like at the Library of Congress, there was, I think it was actually, it mixed in with the papers. It wasn't even a sort of miscellaneous things. There was a piece of paper all folded in on itself And that's always a clue. Like, I'm always like, oh, what did someone think was so important? They're like hiding it in a piece of paper. And I unfolded it, and there was a little piece of paper that said grass. And there were pieces of grass from like 1830 in the I don't know why they saved grass from 1830, but there are all kinds of weird things. Hair, you really never know what you're going to find. I don't like touching dead people's hair. That never thrills me. And yet I feel I have to do it because it's a piece of the person I'm writing about. Sometimes you find things in archives that, yeah, but that's the fun.
We cleared all the questions.
Oh, cool. And Ellen, it was like normal grass, not like grass.
Not
like your lawn. Yes.
All
normal.
right. So do you want to explain how the segue goes, Joanne?
I will do that because we went a little long. Okay, so now we are going to move on to the after party. What that means is we will no longer be recording, so that we can be even freer and easier with whatever we want to talk about. If you beamed in through the NCHE website, just stay right where you are and you will be in the after party. If you are watching us from Facebook, you need to leave Facebook and you need to go to ncheteach.org/conversations to find your way to the link that will bring you here. And then poof, you will be in the after party too. There's a poof. I gave you the poof.
That's your second poof. You did an early poof, very unexpectedly.
Did an early poof. I know, I love this. No poof, no poof. At any rate, thank you as ever for coming here and not letting me get off without saying poof. Engaging in the conversation of democracy, in this case, engaging in a conversation about the preservation and functioning of democracy, which matters. And I salute librarians and archivists from the bottom of my heart, as in relation to this episode. We will be here again next week talking about who the heck knows what, because every day brings some new exciting surprise in the realm of the news. But I appreciate your being here. Yeah, yay, librarians and archivists, it's true. And I want to thank John and Annie as ever for being here and making this possible. My partner in crime, and in a sense, my partners in crime. And I guess we can, I don't know if I forgot something, I'm sort of meandering here, but we can segue our way into the after party.
Just wait on John and